Hey class, it's Miss Shattery. Today we're going to be going through some big ideas notes on domestication and animal impacts. You look at your learning calendar for today. It says that you should listen to the video as I go through the notes. You do have a copy to the notes yourself, so you can look at them, or you can obviously be watching them on the video. As you listen, make sure you write down in your notes for class some big ideas, which include why we domesticated animals, how we currently benefit from these animals, and then what's the difference between primary products, byproducts, and physical work. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with a little bit of review on some topics that we talked about prior to our extended break, and then we'll dive into some new information. So, we already started talking about domestication prior to our break, and so we talked about some big ideas of what domestication is. Apparently, I need to actually click, maybe. That took too many clicks, but that's okay. Domestication, as a reminder, is the process of taming and adapting animals and also plants for use by humans. Okay, so it's this long term project. It's not something that happens in a single generation. It requires lots of generations of animals, but also lots of generations of people. Okay, we were working to do this over a long period of time. Okay, and as we talked about, that involves things like generations of breeding. Okay, so we're always trying to breed for these really specific selective traits. One of the biggest ones was being okay with humans, being relatively calm, being relatively tame. So, how do we look for the animals that we have that are the best behaved, the calmest, the most comfortable with humans? And we want them to have offspring. We want them to produce more babies that have that same personality. And then after that, we can also look for other traits. So, which have the best milk, which produce the most meat, which need the least amount of food to stay healthy and well, characteristics like that. Okay. We also do that through working with animals in close association with people. Okay, so they're interacting with us regularly, and that's part of how it's different than just a tame animal, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Last is that development of dependency. Those animals become reliant on humans for their needs, and we become reliant on them as well. Okay, there's also a genetic component to this. So we're literally changing the genetics of animals over time because we're breeding for things that are different than what nature would think would be advantageous. Okay? In biology, you learn about you know uh, natural selection, right? And in natural selection, whichever traits are best to survive in the natural habitat, those animals live longer, they get more food, they have more babies, which means they pass those beneficial traits on. With domestication, it's kind of the opposite because what we want isn't necessarily what nature wants. So we're doing what's called artificial selection. We're making those choices. We also talked about in class that there are 7 criteria or 7 things that, in general, animals need to meet in order to be considered domesticated. You actually had an assignment for our previous lesson, kind of going back through those. You were supposed to pick a non domesticated animal and try and examine which criteria did you think it met and which criteria did it not meet. Okay. So again, those criteria are that it has to have a flexible diet. We have to be able to provide nutrients easily and efficiently for those animals. Otherwise, we might as well be eating those things ourselves. They have to be a manageable size, which can also tie into diet because if they need too much food, it's not efficient. But also, we have to be able to some extent, control them or be able to keep them in a location in a pen, able to handle them, work with them. They need to be relatively calm or unlikely to panic. Okay, that's that temperament. Um, Able to be in captivity, be in close association with humans. And also, kind of on a similar note, they have to have a good personality, good what we call disposition or temperament. A pleasant, nice animals that are relatively calm are going to be able to work with and integrate into human life. Social hierarchy is also important. That's allowing us to become kind of the top of their social structure. We become the boss or the alpha or the leader of that herd. They also need to grow relatively quickly. Again, that kind of goes into efficiency of resources. They have to be able to produce offspring relatively quickly. And they also have to then be able to be bred in captivity. Something like a cheetah that needs to run miles and miles in order to choose a mate isn't going to work as a domesticated animal because we can't have them running miles and miles. We don't have the space for that, especially now. Domestic versus tamed. I wanted to take another minute to kind of go back to that conversation because that can be a big source of confusion when we talk about animals. There's lots of people who have exotic pets. I'd say quote unquote pets because they're not really pets. They're not, again, domestic. They're not totally tamed. They still retain a lot of wild characteristics. So they're not necessarily always safe. But domestic animals are, as I said earlier, genetically distinct. Okay, because we've bred them to have certain traits, their literal genome, okay, the sum of all of their genetic traits, characteristics, and abilities is different from wild populations. Okay, and that matters because they don't have necessarily, again, all those skills that they would need to live successfully in the wild. With domestic animals, we also talk about something called neoteny, okay, which means that they retain juvenile traits into adulthood. It makes them look more like baby animals than wild animals, or more like babies than adults. We see this in dogs. There's actually a really interesting study on domestication that's taken place over 50 plus years in Siberia, where they have been domesticating Arctic foxes. Excuse me, not Arctic foxes, it's a certain type of silver fox. And so they have, for generations, done just what we think early humans did, where they'd take the foxes that were the nicest and the most calm around people, and they would breed those, and then they would not breed the more aggressive ones. And so what they found is that over time, the actual physical appearance of those foxes have started to change. So they've actually developed offspring, like many, many generations later, that have what we call floppy ears, or ears that aren't sticking upright all the time. They have tails that like wag, whereas wild foxes don't do that. They've even developed different color patterns that we don't see characteristic to the fox, more whites, more splashes of color, etc., because they're retaining more of those juvenile traits. They make them look like babies, which makes us in turn produces this reaction to us, like biologically, that we want to take care of them and we want to interact with them because frankly they're cute. And anybody who's ever looked at a meme or a cat video or a cute puppy video on social media knows that that makes sense because it connects with something in you emotionally. Okay, so that's kind of domestic animals. Again, it's not just that they're a species that's tamed, it's that there's some genetic links or some genetic differences that goes along with that. Tamed animals, as in individuals, are just those that we would consider to be tolerant of humans. Even though you might, again, take a wild squirrel and raise it from a baby and it's used to you, it's still genetically different than if we would domesticate squirrels over, hundreds of years, many generations. Okay. Elephants are a really good example of this. Okay, humans have not domesticated elephants for a variety of reasons, but one of the big ones is that it takes elephants a long time to have babies. They're actually pregnant for about 22 months, which is double the amount of time of horses, which have one of the longer, what we call gestation or pregnancy periods for a domesticated animal at 11 months. So elephants take a long time to have a baby, and they also require a lot of food. Okay, they need a lot of nutrients to grow themselves and to grow their offspring. That's not efficient for humans because while elephants can do some good work for us and they could, potentially supply meat, we can do that more easily and more quickly with other animals. So a lot of times when you'll see like pet elephants, those aren't domesticated elephants. They're actually animals that are taken from the wild when they're babies and they just get used to being around humans. Okay, it's a different situation. Even though that individual might be comfortable with people, it's still a wild animal that just has gotten used to having people around it. One other term I wanted to mention, and this is also feral. Feral is a term that we use to describe domesticated animals that are living in the wild. And around here, feral cats is probably the best example. So they're still domesticated animals, they're still genetically different from wild animals, but we have released them and they're able to survive in the wild on their own. So, a little bit on the history of domestication. Okay, we started this whole process thousands of years ago. And as we talked about in class, the first animal that was domesticated was the dog. Now, we don't know exactly when this happened. One of the problems with examining history that happened thousands of years ago is that there's no actual like written record. There's no book that says, "Hey guys, we domesticated this cool thing called a wolf and now we've turned it into our pet. It's awesome. They're adorable. And also they help us hunt." Okay? There's nothing that says that. So we have to look at lots of different historical sources to create estimations. For dogs, that's especially difficult because early dogs looked a lot like wolves. So it's hard to distinguish what bones are wolf bones versus what are like early domesticated dog bones. But that's really what we look for is we look for the interaction of fossils with of like dogs slash wolves with early fossils of humans. Okay, and where do we see places where those bones are mixed together? Where do we see tools that might indicate that we were working with these animals? Where do we see scavenging sites where like humans left behind, like a woolly mammoth they hunted? Um, and then we also see like examples of like dogs chewing on those bones or wolves chewing on those bones. Okay, so we have to make our best estimation. As you can see on the image below, dogs were domesticated in Eurasia, which basically means that there's fossil evidence around Europe that show early humans interacting with dogs, but there's also information, fossils in Asian areas, particularly across like the Russia area that is in both Europe and Asia, that support both of those theories. And there's actually some really interesting evidence that we domesticated dogs twice. And one of the ways that we look at that is through examining their DNA and where we see changes in their DNA that have allowed for different adaptations. One of those adaptations is actually looking at when were dogs able to start digesting grain. And that kind of indicates that there may have been like a second wave of domestication that happened. Okay? Our next period of time in the history of domestication that's really huge is the agricultural revolution. So, about 12, 10 or so thousand years ago, humans started to go from hunter gatherers or people who foraged for their food, like went out into the woods to find it, to what we call the agrarian or to farming. Okay. So they started to grow first really crops. Okay. Started to realize that, hey, this food is good. It grows every year. What if I take seeds from the very best ones and I put them in the ground myself? Rather than hoping I'm going to find it somewhere out in the forest, I could just drop it in the soil here and it'll grow. And that was a huge revolution because it really fundamentally changed the way that we got food. And that's important to the history of the domestication of animals because being able to grow extra food, okay, especially extra grains, okay, like wheat and corn, etc., okay, those allow us to feed animals as well. And so that really allowed for an easier way to have animals with us all the time. We didn't have to like graze our animals following where fields were open. We could create our own fields and produce excess food for them. So, really, when we look at the history of domestication of livestock species, we tend to start with some of the smaller ones. So, we see goats and sheep in the Middle East first. They're easier to care for, they're easier to travel with, they provide a diverse amount of benefits. And then, as we continue to develop agriculture and create more and more surpluses of crops, then we start to domesticate some larger animals as well. Um, Again, when we talk about the history of how this happened, one of the ways that we track when these dates occurred, and you can kind of see those a little bit on the timeline. It'll be easier to see on yours when you don't have these items in the way from the software. But we actually can trace genetically in humans when we started to develop genes for what we call lactose tolerance, aka people could drink milk and it wouldn't make them sick. So for animals like sheep and goats and cattle, where we can milk them and use that milk, That gene change in humans helps to indicate when we started to work with those animals, when we started to be able to use those products. Okay. The last one I want to specifically talk about for the history of domestication is cats, because cats are kind of weird in that we're pretty sure cats just went ahead and domesticated themselves, proving that cats, as always, do what they want when they want, since basically forever. Okay. So, as humans were, again, creating agriculture as they were growing their own crops, they were starting to produce surpluses. Okay, they had extra food. And that extra food obviously needed something to be done with it. It needed to be stored. And so when you have an excess of wheat or barley or other grain crops, naturally that's going to incite or entice some pest species as well, primarily things like mice and rats, because just like everybody else, they want the easiest access to as much food as possible. And so as humans started to store grains, they found that not only did they have these mice and rats that would be attracted to their grain stores, but then they would have wild cats attracted to their grain stores because there was an easy food source of mice and rats for them. So we really think that cats just kind of ended up working their way towards people because that food source was there, and humans just started being okay with it, and sometimes breeding the cats that they thought were the best mousers or that they liked the best, and that's kind of how we see that play out. Some of the evidence that we have to support that is looking at some of the tombs in the areas of Egypt and Asia. There's skeletal evidence of humans interacting with cats. Ancient Egypt, especially, had a really like reverential thought of cats, and so they would include them in like their burials for some of their important people. And we can see some of those depictions of them even in some of their hieroglyphics. So why? Why did this all happen? At the end of the day, the biggest reason that comes down to it is food. If you're an early human, heck, if you're a human now, like you have to have food to survive. In in any case, the more food you have, the better able you are to continue to survive. And so early domestication of animals was in many ways really about food and the accessibility and availability of food. Even the domestication of dogs allowed for protection but also help hunting down food. Okay, before humans were doing agriculture, they were following herds, they were gathering, and they were trying to hunt down prey animals. And having those companions really helped with that. They could help to cut things out of a herd, they could track things down for them. Okay, it all really goes back to food. And then as we domesticate crops, then it also comes to labor, help moving things, plowing fields, etc. Okay? So crops are really fundamental to our why and also the how animal domestication happened. Okay? And as we developed more resources, as we domesticated more animals, it gave us even more resources to use, which meant that we had more uses in particular when it comes to technology. So these days, obviously, we think of technologies like our computers and our cell phones. And obviously, as we're listening to this video from different places in our community, that is a big example of technology. But back then, technology was as simple, I guess, and it's not simple as something like the wheel, but also better metals, okay? And the ability to make better plows that animals could pull to loosen the soil, which would allow for the better planting of more crops. We also see war as as taking a big change in domestication of animals because we could use animals for war. They allowed us to have better battle tactics. Being a mounted rider was much safer than being feet on the ground in a battle. They could let us carry stronger weaponry and medical supplies to advance troops more quickly, more easily. We could use them to carry messages. And in more recent times, we could even use them. I mean, we currently use them in wars in other parts of the world to do things like detect bombs. So, as technology has changed, the ways that we use animals have changed significantly as well. Which brings us to our big definition. We're going to see really quick. I think I can move this. Let's do that. So today, when we look at how we use and benefit from animals, I tend to break it down into three big categories. So there we go. The first one are the primary products. So, primary products are the major reasons we've raised animals. They're the main items we're getting from them, our main benefits. Generally, primary products are going to be things like meat, milk, eggs, leather, and wool. Okay, those are the main reasons that we raise those animals is to get those things. But in getting those products, there are other things that get left behind or other things that are extra. And we consider those byproducts. Byproducts are any secondary or additional items that we get after harvesting the primary product. So, for example, if I'm raising cattle for meat or milk, or maybe both, okay, eventually, I still have lots of products left, like their fur. We actually can and still do use fur from animals for paintbrushes. We used rennet when we did cheese making, and rennet is something that it can be synthesized from animals, from their digestive tracts, which we talked about. Manure for fertilizer is a huge advantage. You guys are going to be watching a farm tour at the end of next week. And one of the things that we'll talk about is that one of the advantages they have on their farm is that they use a lot of their manure to fertilize their crops. Okay? And those are just a couple of examples. There are so many. If you want some good ideas, you can Google everything but the oink or everything but the moo, and you will pull up these awesome images that go through all of the different things that we use different byproducts we use from cattle and swine. We can use components in their hooves for glues. We can use their blood. Actually, there's chemicals in the blood that we can use for stabilizers for making like boxed cake mixes. There are so many incredible ways that we try to maximize our ability to use the animals we're raising so that things don't go to waste and so that we're honoring those animals and their sacrifice and we're making the most of them. The last thing is physical work. So these are any benefits that are provided by the animal's actions rather than like their body parts, the products we can get from their body parts and the things that they make. Companionship is obviously a huge part of that. You're going to be reading an article that's going to look at the human animal bond and why that's important. There's also actual like physical work that they do, like drug sniffing, pulling wagons, historically pulling plows in fields. All of those are going to be physical work benefits that that animal can also do, that have all really changed the scope of what our lives look like today. If you really think about it, there are so many things that we enjoy and we utilize that wouldn't exist if we hadn't domesticated animals. There's actually some research theory that suggests that humans would have never been able to move to agriculture as a whole, and agriculture would have never been as successful as it has been if it weren't for the domestication of the dog, which led to the ability to domesticate other species as well. So it's really pretty huge the impact that these animals have had on us historically. And then also, I think all of us can identify with the impact that the animals in our lives really matter to us, whether that's our pets or those of a friend or family member. I think we've all got a story that really talks to or looks at how important that connection is to us individually. Okay. Another way I wanted to look at this or mention, there's an organization called Heifer International. Heifer International is all about trying to help people out of poverty and out of hunger through the gift of livestock and the gift of agriculture. So they work with communities all across the world to provide animals for people to get food from, to get work from, to get finances from, to help lift them out of poverty through sustainable agricultural solutions. And when they talk about livestock, they talk about the 7 M's. So to them, there are 7 M benefits that livestock can provide to people. And those are milk, manure, meat, muscle for work, money by selling the animals, selling their products, also materials like wool, like leather, and then motivation. Okay, that motivation of having that animal to take care of and that opportunity to advance yourself and better your life through being able to work with these animals and the things that they provide for us. So those are my sources. I've also got sources for all of my pictures that we use throughout the PowerPoint. And you have access to that PowerPoint. Maybe go back on that weird front page. So at this point, if you have any questions, please email me. Let me know if you need to go back and listen to anything. You can feel free to do that. Uh, but tomorrow we'll keep moving forward. Thanks, guys. Hope all is well. Miss you. Take care.